Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. Catholic social doctrine perhaps remains one of the more misunderstood areas of Catholic teaching. Joining me to have a conversation about the origins of Catholic social doctrine is Matthew Walz. Matthew recently penned a two-part essay in Catholic World Report on the origins of Catholic social doctrine. Matthew, thank you very much for joining us. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing well. Thank you for having me on.
Very glad to speak with you about this. I want to ask you to just begin by talking about what Catholic social doctrine actually is.
Yes, Catholic social doctrine is the Church's attempt, I guess most fundamentally, to shape the consciences of the faithful in their dealing with society at all levels. The family, first and foremost, the political community, secondly, and of course the church as well. So in a certain way, it's an attempt the church's attempt to truly pastor souls as they try to navigate their social lives at each of these three levels.
Can you share with us the fundamental pillars or tenets of Catholic social doctrine?
Oh, yes, sure. Some of the fundamental, usually the church's social doctrine or teaching is thought of according to four pillars or four dimensions. The first and most underlying is the dignity of the human person. So in some ways, the church's whole tradition of anthropology bears on this, both the human person understood, you might say philosophically, as an animal with rationality, but also the human person understood theologically as made in God's own image, and as the Council teaches us, the most recent Council, the only creature on earth to be willed for its own sake. But this is coupled, you might say, or complemented, I should say, with other principles that are at work, one of which is solidarity, that we should stand together as a community, united in justice and charity, so that we are, in fact, mutually supporting one another in our social lives. Also, the principle of subsidiarity, which calls upon human beings in their social lives to exercise freedom at the level at which they are, in fact, the responsible agents. So a sort of push against any sort of overarching totalitarian sort of system where all delegation comes from above. And then finally, and sort of the icing on the cake, is the principle of the common good, that all of us share together and participate in a good that transcends any of our individual goods, the kinds of goods that we experience in communities where we see, for instance, that the good of the family brings with it dimensions of sociality and relationality that are beyond any given individual within that family. And that works its way up in terms of the goods of a political community, and also, of course, the goods of the church. So those are the four basic principles: the dignity of the individual human person, solidarity, subsidiarity, and the common good.
There's a certain mooring here in reason, in philosophy. So all of these things that you've just shared, while deeply theological, can also be ascertained by some level by natural law. Can you please share with us about that?
Yes, I think I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that's actually a really important dimension of Catholic social teaching, that of course it is rooted in revelation and the scriptures in particular, but it's also the teaching of the church that you might say is the most ready to hand and applicable in our everyday life, and therefore must take some of its moorings from human experience and what reason can gather from human experience. So, for instance, if you think of any of those four principles that I laid out, the dignity of the human person, to root that in our experience of ourselves as free and moral agents, and the recognition of others as free and moral agents, which in a certain way you might say non-believers can see that as well. and certainly people who practice other religions besides Catholicism. And I would say the same thing in various ways for subsidiarity, to just realize in a certain way, according to reason, how communities best function in carrying out their activities. Don't they work better when those who are most responsible for the actions of the community are actually closest to the action itself? The common good, you can read about the common good in Aristotle, a pagan philosopher who understands that every community holds together according to a common good that surpasses any private good. And in some ways, we owe and have duties towards the common good. So, yeah, I think that philosophy in that sense plays a particular role in complementing what the scriptures and what the tradition have revealed about the nature of these societies and the right moral action within them. Because, as I said earlier, these are closest to our everyday action, and therefore they, in a certain way, demand to be verified rationally so that we can understand the good both naturally and supernaturally that we are pursuing in our everyday lives, in our social lives.
Why do you highlight figures like Newman and Pope Leo XIII in this conversation on faith and reason?
Yeah, so, in some ways, the social teaching in the church, in one respect, you might say, was there from the beginning of the church. It's in there in the scriptures in various ways. But when we talk about the church's social teaching tradition, we almost always go back to Leo XIII, who began this most explicitly in a magisterial way, to begin publishing what are called social encyclicals. And I mentioned him because he also at that very moment was introducing, or reintroducing, you might say, Thomas Aquinas back into the primary shaper or teacher within the intellectual life of the church. And so one of the reasons in my article that I refer to Newman is because Newman had this funny experience in Rome when he wanted to become a Catholic priest after he had converted, and they suggested that he go to Rome in order to enter seminary, as it were, even though he was older and a rather well-respected intellectual already. But he does go to Rome looking for some good philosophy, especially the thought of Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle. And he found in the middle of the 1800s that it just wasn't there in Rome, that Rome in a certain way had, gotten lazy, as it were, in keeping up its perennial philosophic tradition. And so he makes a funny prediction. In my article, I begin with Newman and a kind of prediction. He says that the Pope has to do something about this. And about 30 years later is when the encyclical Aeterni Patris is published, that brings Thomas Aquinas back into the forefront of Catholic intellectual life. And so partly what I'm trying to argue in my article is to really point out how Newman, seeing this problem, Leo, who had seen this problem in other ways, that part of the problem of the modern political situation we find ourselves in is that it's rooted in philosophy that is either diminishes or distorts, especially the dignity of the human person, and then all that comes from that. And so in a certain way, Newman, Leo, and both of them in terms of looking for Aquinas and Aristotle as support are important in seeing how the church came to a realization that in a certain way they had to address the remnants, or the consequences of the philosophies that were in Europe at the time, from the Enlightenment, from philosophies that were trying to, in a certain way, teach about man apart from God. And the solution to that was the magisterial social teaching.
My guest is Matthew Walz. He's recently penned a 2-part article on the origins of Catholic social doctrine. He will begin serving as president of Thomas More College this September. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon, welcome back. I'm Augustine. I'm talking with Matthew Walz. He is soon to be the president of Thomas More College this September in 2026. He will begin serving then. He's also the author of a two-part article on the origins of Catholic social doctrine and why it's crucial. Matthew, to pick up where we left off, I want to ask you to explain to us the impact of Aeterni Patris, Leo XIII's encyclical. What did it do for the life of the Church, and especially the study of theology?
Yeah, that's a great question, Marcus. I think to understand that, I started to say a little bit about this in the last segment, but we have to be aware of what influence modern philosophy had in Europe at the time, especially at the time of the French Revolution. And in a certain way, there's a deep push to naturalize, you might say, the entire order, or what we might call now secularism, right? To sort of secularize all reality and try to understand reality in a kind of anti-theological way. Mm-hmm. And in Thomas Aquinas, of course, you get the great symphony, you might say, and harmony of faith and reason. So as a kind of response to this secularization project of modernity, Leo comes in with a view that is trying to recover a more holistic understanding of the intellectual life, not at the cost of nature and naturalness, but to realize that nature itself points also beyond itself, and that actually nature in a certain way is lost if you lose that sacramental understanding of it that was so crucial to Christianity. So in a certain way, Aeterni Patris, by bringing Thomas Aquinas back into the conversation very explicitly, in fact, you might even say legislatively, insofar as Leo basically demanded that seminarians be trained in the thought of Aquinas, was a really crucial move to sort of recover that tradition. It didn't go necessarily all that smoothly because, as I was saying earlier, in some ways the church was, had forgotten some of that. Mm-hmm. So it was a little clunky at first. It wasn't quite clear exactly how to do this. And I wouldn't say that we're still in the process of this. I think now, if you turn to seminaries especially, you'll see that the study of Aquinas has a sort of central place now, balanced, of course, with, making sure they know contemporary philosophy and the whole history of philosophy. But there is, in a certain way, the seminaries have overcome this sort of falling prey to modern philosophy as apart from theology. And Thomas Aquinas, who was promoted in Aeterni Patris, is at the center of that discussion, you might say.
The other aspect that you raise is about Aeterni Patris' social impact. How is it a social document?
Yeah, and that's in some ways one of the claims of my article that I kind of came to, that maybe spurred me to write this mm-hmm. article, was at the beginning of Aeterni Patris, which, is known in the church as reintroducing Thomas to seminaries. You might say, what's that have to do with social teaching? Well, it's clear that it's not just for seminaries, although that's the first place. It is also in some ways for all the faithful, the lay faithful included, number one. And number two, it's in the context of thinking about the role that philosophy, you might say, worldviews, if you want to put that a little less strictly as a discipline, but what do sort of cultural and worldviews, what influence do they have mm-hmm. on society? And what happens when a certain kind of philosophy or worldview starts to take over? I mentioned already, say, secularism. How does that actually affect society? So it turns out that the study of philosophy and coming to a kind of a wise view of the whole and a wise understanding of human nature, all of that actually has very important social ramifications. If you think that, for instance, the human being is just an advanced sort of animal only, that view of human nature, a philosophical view of nature, will affect the way that you're going to legislate, for instance, about human beings and how they can be treated. So philosophy plays a really crucial role in sort of the background of society. And I think even though Aeterni Patris looks like it's more directly oriented towards something that has to do with the intellectual life of the church, it's clear from its opening paragraphs, this is in service of the faithful who are living in the world in a certain way under the influence of bad philosophy, and maybe even imbibing it in ways that they are unaware of.
You've mentioned how the church had, by the time Aeterni Patris came about, a lot of factions in the church had largely forgotten the crucial role and rapprochement of reason to the faith.
Yeah.
And now we are seeing a return, a significant balance in that presentation. Are there still factions within the church that see this as suspect and would prefer to return to a completely almost fideistic presentation of revelation and theology only?
Yeah, boy, that's a tough question. I mean, in some ways, those are, on the one hand, I would, this is maybe punting on the question. These are perennial temptations, you might say. I do think that when modern philosophy was wedded to, or at least thought in the minds of people to be wedded to scientific progress very closely, and we can argue about whether that's true or false, I think in some ways the temptation was much greater to punt on the faith-reason question, to think that reason has its own domain and faith has its own domain. I think Leo's sort of on the edge where at the end of the 1800s, and, some of the revolutions that had taken place within the last century or so, even dating back to the French Revolution, things got kind of ugly. And in a certain way, those were not surprising given some of the philosophical understandings of the political community or of the human person that were being trumpeted by the philosophers. So in a certain way, I would say, like the proof is in the pudding in a certain sense. So it does seem to me we're in a better position to judge the fruitfulness of the modern philosophic project. And by that I'm talking about the sort of thoroughgoing dualism of Descartes and how he understands the human person, or Hobbes understands the state of nature as the basis of society, a war of all against all. Some of those have their sort of replays in our age with, the wokeism or the pseudo-Marxism that we're dealing with in our own contemporary society. It does seem to me, though, that the church herself, if I could put it this way, seems more united. And a lot of that has to do with what Leo himself inaugurated. In a certain way, you could argue without Leo, you don't get the council. You don't get a sort of looking back to our sources in conversation with contemporary philosophy and theology. And in a certain way, Aquinas is kind of the middle term of that. Aquinas, who himself is a kind of synthesizing thinker who's trying to bring the whole patristic tradition into conversation with Aristotle, with contemporary medieval thought in his time. So all of that leads to like a kind of recovery of that historical awareness, that this idea that philosophy is just getting always better and better, and therefore the latest philosophy is by definition the best philosophy, becomes a little bit suspect, I would say.
Share with us then the immense benefit that we've seen in the modern life of the church now, ever since the reclamation of Thomistic thought and therefore natural philosophy done right in connection with the faith.
Yeah, well, that's a great question again. I mean, I'm a big student, you might say, of John Paul II and Karol Wojtyla. So in some ways, my mind goes to him as a man who maybe by the way, a pope who has very interesting parallels with Leo the 13th, both end of their century, both with very long pontificates that sort of set a tone. You could say Leo's connected with Vatican I in a way, and John Paul to Vatican II. So there's interesting parallels there. And I would argue that in John Paul II, you see, in some ways, the fruit of Aeterni Patris, a man who is deeply grounded in the thought of Thomas Aquinas and, in a certain way, imbibes his spirit of realism, of attention to the human person, of the harmony between faith and reason, but, like Thomas, very much in conversation with contemporary thought, deeply rooted in the tradition, especially the Greek philosophic tradition. So partly, if we value the papacy and the magisterium of John Paul II, it seems to me we're kind of seeing there the fruit of Aeterni Patris and what Leo XIII envisioned in terms of an intellectual life. That's maybe an argument more by like a certain example, right? Mm-hmm. And yet I think you can see in the church, and I see it, I work with seminarians, I work with young Catholic students in college, you see in them a kind of spirit of Thomas Aquinas that wants to be both rooted in that tradition and able to talk and dialogue with contemporary society.
Matthew, I'm looking forward to future conversations. My guest has been Matthew Walz. He is soon to start as president of Thomas More College in September 2026. I'm Marcus Peter.